faithfully delivering value and interpreting great books worldwide. Hello, this is Sally Talks Books. I'm Wu Haiyun. Today, the book we're interpreting for you is Discipline and Punish, a classic by the French thinker Foucault. Before we dive into this book, let's share a real historical event. In 1757, Frenchman Robert Francois Damiens was sentenced to death for attempting to assassinate King Louis XV. According to records, Damiens endured extremely cruel punishments. The executioner used red-hot pincers to tear flesh from his chest and limbs, then burned it with sulfur. Then, molten lead and boiling rosin were poured into his wounds, followed by 6 horses tearing his limbs apart, and finally his body was burned to ashes and scattered. This Damiens was truly unfortunate. If he'd been born decades later, he probably wouldn't have faced such cruelty. He might have gotten life in prison. Even if sentenced to death, it would have been by guillotine for a quick end. Torture was still common in the mid-18th century, but by the 19th century, it vanished from Europe. In modernization, this shift in punishment either saved lives or reduced death's agony. To many, this seems like a humanitarian victory. However, Discipline and Punish offers a different view. The book says, punishment dropped torture not for humanitarian reasons, but to enforce power more thoroughly. In modern society, the humane approach is just a facade, locking someone up in prison. Actually, compared to execution, it's more effective and crueler. So you might wonder, this clashes with common sense? How do we grasp it? To explain this, Foucault traces torture's disappearance right from the book's start. And from 1760 to 1840, over 80 years, torture stopped being a public spectacle in Western society. Public torture has always been part of human history, everywhere and every era. For instance, the records of the Grand Historian notes the Shang dynasty's roasting punishment, where a greased bronze pillar over charcoal fire forced prisoners to walk barefoot. If they burned and fell, they died in flames. The New Testament of the Western Bible records Jesus' passion, first flogged, then paraded through streets carrying a heavy cross, and finally crucified. In the Scottish national hero film Braveheart, protagonist William Wallace also endured tortures, including castration, disembowelment, drawing and quartering, and burning, before being dismembered with body parts sent to 4 locations in England and Scotland, and his head displayed on London Bridge. Monarchs of that era believed such cruel punishments demonstrated legal justice. Criminals violating royal law had to bear their crimes physically through conspicuously displayed punishments. In other words, these brutal public executions served as both monarchical terror tactics and judicial rituals demonstrating royal power. But by mid-18th century, European reformers criticized public torture, primarily focusing on its barbarity. However, Foucault noted that while cruel, public torture wasn't primitive impulse but a precise technique, even an art, driven by rational considerations. For punishment to qualify as torture, it must meet 3 criteria. First, the inflicted pain must be precisely measurable. Instead of sudden death, it fragmented life into countless microdeaths, inflicting meticulously calibrated agony. Lash counts, burning durations, flaying angles, and garroting pressure were all calculated with precision. Second, torture required ritualistic elements. European public executions featured street processions, stops at crossroads and churches, public verdict readings, forced kneeling, and confessions. Finally, public torture and executions had to be spectacular, held in marketplaces or squares to maximize spectators, all serving to awe populations with monarchical power. Now, you might ask, why then did judicial reformers criticize torture? Because such public displays could backfire. For instance, if folks think an execution's unjust, they might snatch the prisoner from the executioner, using violence to seek pardon, just like the Liangshan heroes rescuing Song Jiang by storming the execution ground. especially if the prisoner stays calm under torture. Then he gains a strength no power can conquer, and the crowd might even hail him as a hero. Worse still, when people watch violence too long, it stops being so scary. By the 18th century, execution grounds had turned into sites of revelry. On execution days, folks would halt daily work, and bars near the gallows would be jam-packed. Torture was supposed to showcase the monarch's deterrence, but it might become frenzied mass entertainment, losing its essence. This shows that public torture's attempt to proclaim power to the masses is highly unstable. In Foucault's view, European judicial reformers criticized torture as brutal, but they were just using brutality as a lofty pretext. What they truly disliked were the chaos stemming from torture. Its loss of deterrent effect showed power enforcement was weak over 2 centuries ago. And monarchs might seem almighty, but their power didn't reach far. For example, anyone familiar with water margin knows the emperors or Gaoqi's authority grew thin outside the capital. Like Chai Jin, a descendant of the later Zhou imperial family who loved befriending exiled prisoners, whenever they passed his domain, he'd connect with them. The truth is, in traditional society, monarchs had few ways to display authority, and torture was one of them. But this royal violence often faced resistance or imitation from the populace, forcing monarchs to escalate violence levels. Yet this couldn't steadily expand authority, only creating a vicious cycle. So, in ancient society, power structures looked tough but were actually weak, chaotic, and unstable. But as people moved from ancient to modern times, power operation demanded stability, order, and step-by-step processes. In Europe's 18th century modernization, judicial reformers aimed less at fairer, more humane punishment and more at establishing stable, efficient, lasting principles to enforce power's will. Only then could long-term stability be achieved. Coincidentally, mature capitalism emerged in Europe then. Society demanded new justice standards, and public torture met its end. Back then, the bulk of criminal cases shifted from physical harm to economic crimes. Moreover, the rise of the bourgeoisie and industrial economy transformed society's view of people. People became labor forces with economic utility and commercial value. As long as someone still had exploitable value, there was no rush to kill them. Thus emerged new punishments aiming not to take lives, but to reform criminals into useful members of society. Consequently, punishment stopped being public spectacle and ceased focusing on inflicting physical pain. The new system incarcerated prisoners, controlling them through deprivation of freedom and forced labor. Foucault called this system discipline, composed of regulation and training, with 3 methods: surveillance, normative judgment, and examination. First, surveillance, a more intuitive technique. First, place each person in relatively enclosed spaces, assigning fixed positions. It's like creating a grid in space, each person in their own cell, each cell containing one person. This makes crowds easily analyzable and controllable spaces. To go to row 2, who's missing from row 3? Everything between the rows becomes clear at a glance. This spatial distribution enables surveillance, discipline's primary method. Modern society controls behavior through surveillance alone, activating power. Discipline's second method, normative judgment. Simply put, establish norms, then grade compliance. Perfect match gets 100, 90 is excellent, 70 to 80 is mediocre, below 60 fails, indicating rule violation. How to comply and score high? This involves 2 trainings, temporal and bodily. Temporal training instills time awareness, scheduling work and life by timetables. Today, this time consciousness is deeply ingrained. Unpunctuality or waste is seen as moral failing. Time regulates everything, from individuals to the whole world, so much that we almost forget this is a modern construct, a learned discipline. Bodily training prescribes optimal postures and defines ideal movement directions and intensity. Sounds abstract? Let's look at a simple example. We all know kids learning to write must first master proper posture. What exactly is this correct writing posture? Let's recall together. Sit upright with shoulders level, head straight, slightly forward, back straight, chest out, feet flat, shoulder width apart, plus the 3-1 rule. 1 inch from pen to hand, 1 fist from chest to desk, 1 foot from eyes to desktop. Even how you place your feet is regulated. Teachers claim only this posture ensures good handwriting while reducing fatigue and protecting vision. But Foucault offers a darker view. He argues such regulations constitute bodily training. In modern society, bodies aren't natural but manufactured. How we write, eat, work, even sleep, all trained behaviors. Normative judgment first establishes standards. These could be laws, regulations, or plans, all human-made order systems. Once established, all temporal and bodily training must align with these norms. A technician's skill level, student's assignment time, apprentice's training period. Surveillance and judgment follow set norms. Combined, these form discipline's core mechanism. The third method, examination, tracks training progress through surveillance, creating comprehensive records. Now we see discipline's full picture, making power control more effective. More controllable than terror-based public torture. Power positions people in segmented spaces, establishes grading systems, and completes normalization through examination training cycles. The modern prison embodies this disciplinary power mechanism most thoroughly. If traditional punishment, represented by torture, is about making people die and deciding how they die, then modern punishment, represented by prison, is about making people live, but regulating how they live. As an institution for reforming people, all designs of prison serve discipline. The primary principle of prison is isolation, which not only means isolating prisoners from the outside world, but also isolating them from each other. At night, prisoners must use single cells. Although inmates can be together during the day, they must maintain absolute silence and can only speak softly to guards after obtaining permission. This isolation system in prison aims to eliminate harmful consequences from grouping prisoners together, nipping conspiracies and rebellions in the bud. Solitary confinement also induces loneliness, prompting reflection. Subsequently, feelings of remorse arise, leading to more docile acceptance of reform. Isolation mechanisms alone are not enough. Prisoners must labor in prison. Some believe that forcing prisoners to labor is to make them generate value, bring economic benefits to society, thereby compensating for harm from crimes. But Foucault points out prisoner labor has limited scope and can't bring much profit. Its main purpose is discipline. Without oppression, a work system naturally establishes hierarchy and surveillance, making prisoners submit to routine. Transforming prisoners from wild, agitated individuals into rule-abiding roles. Moreover, prisons adhere to strict timetables. For example, in Foucault's time, Paris juvenile detention rules had routines starting at 6 a.m. winter, 5 a.m. summer, with 9 hours labor, 2 hours study, even waking up followed strict procedures. At the first drumbeat, guards open cell doors, and prisoners must get up, dress, and maintain silence. At the second drumbeat, they must be fully dressed and make their beds. At the third drumbeat, they must line up and proceed to the chapel for morning prayers, with each drumbeat interval 5 minutes. And when prisoners follow the strict timetable for labor, guards continuously observe and record their behavior. Based on their behavior, the prison rewards or punishes prisoners, and those records become key references to maintain effective operation. In Foucault's view, this disciplinary method, executed by modern prisons compared to past torture, is a more invasive form of psychological control. Every moment in prison, inmates are under surveillance and discipline. Over time, criminals' souls or psyches are altered, and upon release, they often become living specimens of the punishment system. Now, we've understood what discipline is and its typical example in modern society, prison. But note that in modern society, discipline doesn't only appear in prisons. Foucault points out that besides prisons implementing traditional power, many other institutions also practice discipline. This mechanism includes the military, hospitals, factories, and schools. They constantly enforce a will, training members into submitters of power. First, let's look at how a factory is managed. First, arrange the space layout based on the production process, so each worker has their fixed position. Second, train workers, which means dividing the production process, establishing standard models, and using them to train workers' physical strength, endurance, agility, and proficiency. Then, the factory establishes a reward and punishment system to ensure workers produce the most and best output within set times. Hearing this, someone might say, oh, that's like big factories, such as Foxconn, which is quite scary. But now, in more advanced companies, the work environment isn't so oppressive, and they might not even have attendance checks. People will say that might be a bit naive. Modern companies' disciplinary methods may not be so obvious, but they can still control people subtly. For example, many companies now implement salary confidentiality policies, requiring employees not to discuss wage information with each other. In principle, how much do you earn in a month? Besides yourself, only your manager and HR can know. If you casually share your salary, you might even get fired. Why is there such a system? If you go ask HR this question, they'll most likely tell you it's for the company's standardized management. They're not wrong. This is standardized management. Employees are still placed in small, enclosed boxes. It's just that the boundaries of these boxes are invisible to the naked eye. Now, let's look at schools. Schools are important disciplinary institutions in modern society, which is evident from their architecture. In a typical school, classrooms line a corridor, each with front and back doors featuring windows, plus a large window on the corridor wall, all designed for surveillance convenience. Inside classrooms, desks must be arranged in perfectly straight rows. Each student's seat is fixed, ensuring teachers can monitor behavior at a glance. For discipline enforcement, schools implement rigorous monitoring systems. Program teachers appoint student cadres, from senior captains to junior captains, forming a hierarchical supervision structure. Academically, schools employ normative judgment through scores and rankings to categorize top or bottom students and track progress. Needless to say, schools constantly organize exams as examination institutions. Undeniably, you witness a recurring exercise of power. Rituals are woven into learning. Here, someone might interrupt. Wait, this describes exam-oriented education. Quality-oriented education isn't like this. But is that true? How does a child demonstrate their quality-oriented education? Still through various forms of normative judgment. Claim piano skills? You'll need grade 10 certification or competition awards. Claim swimming excellence? That requires mastering standardized strokes like breaststroke, backstroke, or butterfly. Even seemingly subjective skills like painting and dance have standardized grading systems for every quality. Thus, quality-oriented and exam-oriented education differ only in what they standardize, not in essence. In other words, discipline has overflowed prisons into every societal corner. Moreover, discipline's efficiency has skyrocketed, becoming self-operating power. Early disciplinary systems used hierarchical surveillance, pyramid structures where guards monitored cell grid prisoners by floor. Guards reported to unit managers, who aggregated data for wardens, completing the daily surveillance cycle. There's a very vivid image online. One person holding a gun to two others' heads, who then do the same. Two people manage four, four manage eight, and so on. You need to hire 500 million people to manage over 1 billion. While real hierarchical surveillance isn't this numerically rigid, human resource consumption remains enormous. This method is quite traditional. There's significant room for improvement in both cost and effectiveness. Therefore, a man named Bentham made crucial improvements. Who was Bentham? He was a British jurist, economist, and philosopher living in the late 18th to early 19th century. Bentham designed a new prison architecture called the Panopticon. And let me describe this prison design. The Panopticon is first a circular building divided into many enclosed cells. At the center stands an observation tower with windows facing all cells. Entering this tower allows monitoring every prisoner. Prisoners in cells can see the tower guard, but no other inmates. Theoretically, with so many cells, guards can only occasionally focus on specific prisoners, never comprehensively. But prisoners never know when the tower's bays might fall on them, keeping them perpetually terrified. Thus, external surveillance transforms into prisoners' self-monitoring. Therefore, panoptic surveillance not only drastically reduces costs compared to hierarchical systems, but significantly improves effectiveness. In other words, power can be subtly exercised with minimal cost. Influenced by Bentham, since the 1830s, the panopticon became the blueprint for most Western prison designs. However, Foucault delved deeper than Bentham. He saw something darker in this design, not just changes in power's cost effectiveness, but in power itself. Power, simply put, it's making others obey your will. In the panopticon, power itself transforms in two aspects. First, those holding power no longer need to appear personally. The power mechanism operates automatically. Let's imagine an upgraded panopticon prison with its central watchtower. The tower features one-way glass, visible from inside but opaque outside. Even without guards, power's effect persists. Secondly, since power operates without a specific face, disciplinary power becomes shareable by all. Anyone could occupy the watchtower, warden or janitor. People could even implement this setup. Every city resident could enter that watchtower and serve as warden for a day. Similar to countries requiring eligible citizens to serve as jurors periodically, to Foucault, this makes everyone part of the power structure. Foucault believed modern power isn't oppressive control by few, but diffused throughout social networks, making each person a node in power relations. You could be both power's enforcer and its subject. You're accustomed to being monitored, judged, and recorded, while mastering skills to supervise, regulate, and inspect others. For example, on social media, one sees crowds while being seen by crowds. Individuals get doxxed, exposed, criticized by hidden scrutineers. When you comment, like, or repost, you're exercising power. But if you break norms or offend, you instantly become the monitored target. Foucault never saw today's internet, but he wouldn't be surprised, because he'd already declared, modern society lives in an archipelago of prisons. We're not in an arena or on stage. We're in a panoptic society under omnipresent power interventions. A modern society can be seen as a giant prison. Foucault's central thesis in this book and the core of its enduring influence. Just as Marx evokes Das Kapital and Tocqueville, the old regime and the revolution, mention Foucault and Discipline and Punish inevitably surfaces. Its impact spans philosophy, sociology, political science, and historical studies. In 2017, British scholars analyzing Google Scholar citations identified the 25 most cited social science books, with Discipline and Punish ranking 7th. Its prominence comes from revolutionizing our understanding of power. People typically associate power with coercion, violence, and commands, always backed by dictators or small groups, as if only brute force constitutes real power. But Foucault reveals otherwise. Modern power diffuses across everyone, forming an intricate network. Schools, armies, hospitals, factories are all refined versions of the prison system. Everyone is born into this power web. You attend school, work in factories or corporations, visit hospitals when ill, and eventually push your children onto this same path. However your life unfolds, you inevitably enter some disciplinary mechanism. We not only can't escape this, but remain largely indifferent. We obey rules, we embrace order, we fear chaos. We cooperate with power to submit to various wills and may demand others comply with power norms. We surrender time to schedules, bodies to gyms, and growth to endless discipline. After confronting this harsh truth, you might ask, what can we do? Is human freedom still possible? Regrettably, Foucault offered no solutions. Foucault merely analyzed modern power's mechanisms, teaching us how to comprehend society and contemporary humans. Regarding escaping power's constraints, he proposed no revolutionary or reformist plans. Per Foucault's theory, true human liberation seems impossible. This world you inhabit, either it's an authoritarian society or a panopticon-style society. All right, that concludes our interpretation of discipline and punish for you. Reading notes are below the audio. We'll see you tomorrow.